Hey guys, today we take a dive into one of the most important games in chess history that changed our path forever. It's the game between Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov, the first ever game between a chess computer and a reigning world chess champion. Let's see how it went. Starting with e4, c5, and c3, we entered the Alapin variation. d5, takes, and d4. We enter the main variation of the Alapin system. Knight f6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, and e6. And now white decided to play h3. The usual move would be short castling followed by knight c6, and we enter the main variation, but the computer Deep Blue decided to play h3. Now bishop h5, short castling, knight c6, and bishop e3. The idea of this move is to put pressure on the c5 pawn, so white actually threatens to take on c5, so black has to take on d4 by himself, takes c4, and now white has no pawn anymore on c3 and wants to play knight c3 in order to attack the queen on d5. A usual move that we would play today would be bishop e7. That's the main theory line nowadays, but the game was played in 1996, so almost 30 years ago, and people didn't know about this beautiful line. Short castling by black, and white shouldn't take on b7, because after he does, rook b8, and black can win the pawn on b2 as well, and has a very active rook on b2. But again, this bishop move was not very common in the late 90s. There were no computers after all, so Garry Kasparov had to learn everything by himself on the board, and he played the move bishop b4. Still a good move, but not the best from today's point of view. White played a3, bishop a5, and knight c3. Now black could actually take on c3, but this would strengthen the pawn on d4, because now white can play c4, maybe d5 later on, and this would be bad because the white's pawn on d4 used to be quite bad, and if we take on c3, this pawn becomes quite strong. Therefore, the reigning world champion decided to play the move queen to d6, and now after knight b5, play queen e7, retreatment, and knight e5. So Deep Blue had a very aggressive approach, trying to attack, trying to get Garry into problems, but still the position is quite trash in this moment. Short castling, rook c1, rook c8, everything fine so far. And now bishop g5, and this move is quite interesting because white has a lot of ideas he wants to pursue. First of all, maybe something like knight to g4 and strengthening the pressure on the f6 knight, but as well some ideas like queen f3 with the idea of having a threat on c6. Now, the best move would have been a6 and threatening the b5 knight by white, so maybe takes on f6, pawn takes on f6. We cannot take with the queen because of knight d7, and our rook and our queen are attacked, so we have to take with the pawn. And then knight c6, because both our knights are attacked, so we have to trade a knight, and that's quite a good position for black. But a slight inaccuracy by Garry Kasparov with bishop b6. Now black has to take again with the pawn on f6, but white doesn't have to take on c6, but can play knight c4. Now these beautiful knights on b5 and c4 have a lot of good ideas, and the bishop on b6 is quite weak. Rook d8, takes, and now we have a double pawn that is not very nice looking. f5, queen e3, queen f6. Garry tries to get some pressure on the d4 pawn, but white just plays d5, sacrifices the pawn in order to weaken up the good pawn structure from black. And on the other side, of course, b6 is hanging, so after rook d5 takes, white has actually kind of good position because these pawns are very loosened up. Now white played b3, maybe a little bit better would have been the move b4, but it's just very slightly marginal. King h8, queen to b6, and now you can imagine the problems of black arriving. Rook g8, Garry completely focuses on having a counter attack on the king side, but white can simply attack the pawn on d5, and now the best move would have been to reconsider the choice of playing rook g8 with rook d8, protecting the pawn on d5 as well as the square d6, because the knight can actually conquer this square otherwise. And now after rook d8, maybe something like rook d1, attacking the pawn on d5, and now playing the move d4, and let's say something like a4 if white just does nothing, then black has the idea of playing f4 as well as f3 and attacking on the king side, and there's actually not a lot that white can do against it. So that would have been the best move, rook d8, but Garry Kasparov made a slight inaccuracy that changed the path of the game dramatically. b4. Now knight d6, the only move that gets white in a heads up, because f5 is hanging, b7 is hanging, and now the problems get started. f4 and knight takes b7. Now knight e5, a good move, was played to get pressure on d3 and f3. If f3 immediately played, then g3 would just be a good move, and the c6 knight is hanging, and the d4 pawn is also kind of weak, so this would not be a good idea for black. But knight e5 was played, and the only move that gets white again in a comfortable position is queen d5, and it was played by the first version of the chess computers, with Deep Blue finding all these marginal moves to find. f3, g3, knight d3, and now white has two options, rook c7 and rook c6, that he has to play. Rook d1 would actually be a very bad move because of the only move, queen f4. Now white cannot take the queen, of course, because the rook prevents it, but queen d8 is the only move that prevents white from losing, because black itself wants to take on g3. So something like rook d3 would be bad because of rook takes g3. It takes g3, queen g3, king h1, and queen to g2 checkmate. So therefore, queen to d8 would be the only move that's not losing. But in the game, Deep Blue played the move rook c7, attacking f7 from the backside, and now rook e8, trying to get some pressure from the first row, but knight to d6, again the best move in this position, rook e1, king h2, and knight takes f2, threatening to checkmate the white one. But again, the only move to win was played by Deep Blue, almost a perfect game. Takes f7, king g7, knight g5, king h6, and after rook h7, white could win the game, and Garry Kasparov gave up, and the game was won by the chess computer. Well, after rook h7, what was Garry thinking? After king g6, he probably calculated queen to g8, king f5, and knight takes f3, and now the rook on e1 is hanging, as well as there is a possible pin on f7 with the white's rook on h7, so white is either going to win the rook on e1 or the queen on f6, and this is of course just completely winning, and Garry Kasparov acknowledged the strength of this chess computer in the first game. So although the computer won the first game of the competition, Garry Kasparov nevertheless won the first match with a late comeback, but the rematch later on was won by Deep Blue. Therefore, you can say that this first match was the beginning of the dominance of computer chess. Bye bye.